Welcome to this talk about the Ianson's architects. This is a Clapham Society event for the Lambeth Heritage Festival. My name is Alyson Wilson and I am a member of the Clapham Society Local History Group, and with my colleagues Andrew Saint and Timothy Walker, we are to introduce you to this book written by our friend and colleague Peter Jefferson Smith, who unfortunately died before the book was published. It was completed and published by the Clapham Society after his death. And this is how the evening will run. First of all, I'll give you a brief biography of the author, Peter Jefferson Smith. Then I'll explain how the book was completed and published. Then Andrew Saint will tell you something about each of the three architects and their importance to the development of building and construction work and the development of the architecture profession in the 19th century. Timothy Walker will then speak about their work in South London and most particularly in Clapham. And I shall then conclude with a few pictures of buildings which can still be seen in the city, which haven't been shown before, and mainly in the village of Greyshot, to which the family, where the family had an estate later in their lives. First of all, this is Peter Jefferson Smith, he was born in 1939 in Ely in Cambridgeshire. After a history degree at Trinity College, Cambridge, he joined Her Majesty's Custom and Excise, where he spent his whole career, finishing up as deputy chairman on his retirement in 1995. He came to live in Clapham as soon as he got a job, actually, and in 1964 he married Anna, and they have lived in Clapham together all these years, ever since then, and have two daughters. Peter had a lifetime interest in history, and especially in the history of Clapham and South London. He was a member of many local societies, including the Clapham Society, the Streatham Society, the Clapham Antiquarian Society, London Topographical Society, and endless others. He had a huge interest in researching and finding out the answer to any question of any local interest, which is probably what he was easily diverted, and this is probably why his book took nearly 30 years to complete. But he was involved in many other local activities. Particularly, he was involved in a campaign to save a lot of Clapham that was being destroyed in the 1970s by rebuilding. He was involved with the Holy Trinity Church as their archivist for many years, and in particular with restoring the church bells, as he was a bell ringer, and he was instrumental in setting up the South East London Community Foundation and chairman of the trustees, and probably most interesting to many local people, he was a leader in the restoration of the bandstand on Clapham Common. He was author of many books and articles about Clapham, and he conducted many walks, gave talks and arranged exhibitions right up to a few months before his death. In his researches into the area particularly, he was intrigued by the frequency with which this rather curious name Ianson cropped up. And it was this that set him on his 30-odd year research into the lives and works of these three architect surveyors whose lives spanned the whole of the 19th century. He put all this together gradually over the years, but sadly died late in 2018, leaving the completed text, but many other details to be finished to produce a book. Some months before his death, Peter had asked members of the Clapham Society Local History Group to read the text. Timothy and I did so, but were unfortunately unable to speak to him about it before his death. We were determined, however, that over 30 years' worth of very detailed research should not go to waste. So we decided that the book would be completed by the Clapham Society in memory of and as tribute to Peter. This was done with the help and enthusiasm of many of his friends. I was fortunate enough to immediately enlist the help of these two splendid colleagues who are really the co-producers of the book, who worked tirelessly for many months on it. Andrew Saint distinguished academic, architectural historian, general editor of the Survey of London from 2006 to 2015, who was responsible for many of the rather tedious and time-consuming details of the book, including checking, editing, and generally sorting out notes, compiling the index, and also for making many very excellent suggestions. Andrew had come to know Peter well at the time of the publication of the Battersea volumes of the Survey of London. And Timothy Walker, the third member of the team, who is a historian, distinguished historian, especially of Clapham, who's published many books about Clapham and has a website entitled The Clapham Historian. Timothy was responsible for getting the text together, corrected, edited, and computer ready to send to the publisher. My role was largely in finding illustrations and tying up the ends and cajoling people into producing the stuff at the time we needed. Many others gave freely of their services as a tribute to Peter, and these included, of course, Anna and her family, Dana Kubik, who took the new photographs in London, our designer Claire Fry, who enhanced the older pictures and prepared them for publication, and also designed the cover. Nicholas Long provided an extensive family tree, which Claire managed to cut down to fit a double-page spread in the book, and which I would love to have shown you some of. It was completely impossible to show it on the screen. Another person, Roger Armstrong, was responsible for all the photographs outside London in the village of Greyshot. And I should particularly mention David Weston, who drew the delightful maps, which you will see later. But there were many other people too who checked parts of the books in which they had special expertise. We took the decision that we would not alter Peter's text in any way, but we did check for any recent changes or slight inaccuracies. Many friends of Peter's and members of the Society also made financial contributions in his memory towards the cost of publication. We were very anxious to publish as soon as possible after Peter's death, which occurred in December 2018. So we were pleased and proud, I think, to be able to launch the book in November 2019, within a year of his death. One thing that I should mention just quickly before passing you over to Andrew is that, the front cover of the book, which I'd meant to show you before, is that the speculation about the rather unusual name, which is actually Alyson, not Lanson, that is with an I and not an L, which causes some concern and interest. In fact, I should say at the beginning that it is often changed to Jansen with a J. And so people speculated that it may have an origin in either Holland or some Scandinavian country. As far as we know, this is not true. The name can be traced back to Tudor times in North Yorkshire and is still not uncommon there. In fact, very soon after publishing the book, I had an email from a Chris Alyson in Thirsk, who runs a big feed merchant company. And I'm pleased to say, I hope, we have an Alyson member, family member in the audience. I think there must be several of them around because in typical Victorian fashion, they all had a lot of children, between sort of 6 and 8 in each thing. So here are the 3 of them. And with that, I shall hand you over to Andrew. So we're not too familiar with this system, but we will hope to pass over reasonably quickly. Andrew.
Very good, thank you. Let's see whether this works. Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
They can't answer back, can they? Alyson, thank you very much for that introduction, and hello everybody. Before I go any further, I must say that of course Alyson has characteristically underplayed her role in all this, because she was definitely the primus inter pares in the getting together of this book, and she is the person on whom everything really rested, and it's a wonderful experience for me to work with her for the first time. I hope it'll happen again. Anyhow, my role is to talk about these 3 chaps and try and tell you a little bit about how they differed and what their different roles were, and explain what they have come to mean to me, as it were, just a bit more than themselves. Here you see, as you've seen them before, three respectable looking gentlemen of the 19th century with the same name, which is very confusing: father on the left, son in the middle, and the grandson on the right. And the second and third generations show a distinct tendency towards baldness. What else could you say about them? Peter's book draws a wonderful picture of these three gentlemen's lives, and of course any lives set out in detail are fascinating in themselves and whet our curiosity. But is there any more to it than just the personal story? Do these chaps stand for anything we can learn from today? I believe they do, especially if you're interested in the way that London burst open in the 19th century. It struggled with the almost insuperable problems of finding that it was the biggest city in the world, growing in every direction, and how London very gradually overcame its problems and ended up adding a measure of civilization to its vast extent. And here I'm showing you the famous drawing by the inimitable George Cruikshank, showing London going out of town, or the March of Bricks and Mortar, published as early as 1829, and indicating already what a sense there was of this behemoth overwhelming the countryside and showering bricks and mortar on all these poor old trees and ditches and hedges and so forth. The horror was to get greater. And my argument is the Jansens were among those who, in a kind of way, helped, as far as it could be tamed, to tame it. Now, there are, of course, many ways of telling this story, and from different angles. You can tell it from the social side, the architectural side, the administrative side, the religious side, and so forth. But Peter's book, in its interesting way, offers a new one, because it's about a dynasty of middle-class men who would have seen themselves, and not as social reformers at all, but as practical men, tackling issues of building and construction as they presented themselves, and were happy to make a good living out of it as they went along. Of course, these issues changed and moved on as London developed, and the shifting pattern of these three men's careers are a pretty good introduction to understanding these changes. So I'm going to just take them in order. And there will be some duplication in the photographs I show, and those that Alyson has shown and Timothy will show, but I don't think there's any harm in that. Now, a little bit about the father, the old man, the first Edward Jansen, who you see in the left-hand corner here. He's really best defined as a surveyor, though in his day, talking about the early part of the 19th century really, people didn't make a very clear distinction between architects, between surveyors and builders. They're all mixed together. Some architects like to think they didn't do any building, but most of them actually did. Typically, he comes out of a family in the building trades already. His dad is a carpenter, I think, as far as I remember. At the outset of his career, London's fairly small by our standards. It's hardly more than the City, the West End, and the inner East End, with a certain amount of sprawl on our side of the river. I suspect most people watching in here live to the south. Clapham, which is the place which most concerns people today on watching this, is still at that time a suburban village, but increasingly inhabited by the better off commuters, as I'm sure you all know. Jansen isn't a Claphite to start with. He works and lives in the city, which is shedding population fast, and he follows that trend. When in middle age, he moves out to the cottage, that's what he called it, which you see in the bottom here, picturesque cottage, out at Wandsworth, Burntwood Cottage. But his life is in the city. It's mostly in and around the city, and he lives in this rather charming lane, which just about exists still, though it doesn't look nearly as nice as this 1930s drawing is. That's Lawrence Pountney Lane, which is kind of in the southeast. It's quite close to the Thames, as I'm sure a lot of you know, a little bit to the south of Mansion House. And what's he mostly doing? Well, it's odd jobs to a large degree, surveying small properties and estates, quite a lot of repairing of the Wren City churches. Also, the other thing he's doing, he's in a partnership with a clever but rather disorganized architect called Daniel Alexander, who you see here. And Alexander is actually in work in a big way. He gets into trouble at one point. But his most famous job was the London Docks. That's not the whole of the docks as we understand it today, but what was called the London Docks, which is more or less where the Musan International plant was till quite recently. A lot of it's been destroyed, but the tobacco dock, which you may just be able to see above the large expanse of water there, that still survives in a certain shape and form. And very interesting it was too. I don't think we can say Janssen designed any of it. He probably helped with some of the surveying tasks and perhaps the technical stuff, because all these Janssens were good at the technical side of construction. Well, taking this chap, Janssen Senior, on his own, as it were, the most significant work he undertakes is not really visible because it's underground. It's to do with sewers. Now, we all know that drains matter and affect health, and that the Victorians were very hot on drainage, but the science of urban drainage was only evolving in the first half of the 19th century. A famous name, which I'm sure most of you heard of, is that of Bazalgette, who sorted out London's main drainage with a massive programme of works in the 1860s. But what Peter's book does is to help to rehabilitate Bazalgette's predecessors, who worked together in a rather fragmented way on something called the Commissions of Sewers. Each part of London had a Commission of Sewers, and it was the lack of joined up thinking which made one of the problems in getting the drainage and sewage of London right. Janssen Senior, he worked for a body called the Surrey and Kent Commission of Sewers, all south of the river stuff, as you can tell. And what you're seeing on the screen now are on the left rather an interesting example of a kind of patent cast iron valve to a sewer. There was lots of argument about what shape sewers should be. Should they be round, should they be oval, or should they be shapes like this, and what they should be made of, bricks or cast iron. And I think Janssen was a bit of a cast iron man. And rather amazingly, there is this rather unusual survivor in Bermondsey of the sewer keeper's cottage of what was called the Duffield Sluice, where one of the main outlets of the Surrey and Kent sewers came out to the Thames. Of course, they didn't think twice about throwing all the sewage into the Thames. That's a long story we can't go into now. But there is this rather sweet cottage, almost certainly designed by Edward Janssen Senior, with a little plaque on top of it giving the date, 1822. So that's rather good, and this is probably his main memorial. Now, I go on a little bit to the son, Edward Janssen Jr. It's confusing. We tend to call him Senior, Junior, and EB in order. And this chap is the hero of Peter's book. There's no question. He's a kind of classic overachieving Victorian who never gets to sleep at all. He has lots of children, has lots of maids to make a cup of tea and boil an egg. He never sees those kinds of things at all. He has his finger in a much wider variety of pies than his father. Like his father, he has surveying skills, and he joins him in the sewer work. They all join in, one joins in the other, and then the old person dies and another one takes over. It's all quite smooth. But Edward Janssen Jr. has a much better education than his dad, involving a good deal of foreign travel. And here's rather a nice watercolour, one of quite a lot he did when he was travelling in Italy. It's the Obelisco Sallustiano, which is just above the Spanish Steps, which some of you will know, in Rome, where he was in the 1830s as a young man. So a typical pattern, the young architect goes abroad, and no doubt his dad had done well enough to be able to afford this journey for his son. And he comes back with all these extra skills. He knows about classical architecture, etc., etc. And this sets him up to be an architect of the new professional kind. And also by this time, London can offer enough, and the size of the building market is big enough to sustain a practice which is just architecture. He doesn't have to do all sorts of bits of scruffy work here and there, although in fact he does continue to hang on to a lot of the estate surveying, partly because I think it's lucrative. He's not so much involved in the minor surveying works, but it's looking after properties for landowners, that kind of thing. There's quite a lot of that work he's doing, but architecture is the main ambition in the sense we understand it today. In many ways, he's a typical professional figure of his day. He builds buildings of every kind. You've got schools, you've got churches, you've houses, in that extraordinary Victorian mixture of styles. He's not in favour of any one. He can do anything you like. He can do Romanesque, he can do Gothic, he can do classical. And he's no slouch in giving technical papers about it all, either to the Royal Institute of British Architects. This is a nice portrait of him, showing how bald he really was, which I think it belongs to the RIBA, of which he was a very fervent member, often going on giving papers and commenting on others. So a very busy man in all sorts of ways. But in one particular regard, and one only, I think he's an original. That is that this man, more than anyone else, was responsible for working out the plans for the new business offices which were being built in the City of London. So in that way, he does hang on to his father's city practice. These kinds of offices were starting to replace the old houses from which nearly all commercial firms had operated up to his father's time. It's surprising to us, perhaps, but it's amazing. And it's amazing, it's very much the truth. If you read Dickens, you get this very clearly, that most banking and commercial and business firms in the city worked in old houses. And in very badly lit ones, the office building type was a new thing in the 1840s, 50s and 60s. Unfortunately, most of what you built in the city has gone now, and what survives looks tiny compared to the monstrous city offices we're all used to today. Here are a couple, and I think Alyson's going to show these again and talk to them about a little bit more about them at the end of the little programme tonight. And it's great to see they survived the Royal Exchange buildings at the top and the Corn Exchange chambers a bit further east on the right. But in a kind of way, they don't really show what was important about these buildings, which was the plans, getting light into these rather dense city sites. And you can think of these buildings as a kind of essential part of the modernising of London, to which all the Jansen dynasty contributed in their different ways, and from which they made very good money. There's a rather nice title to one of Peter's chapters, which is called Good Art and a Feeling of Cash. And the Jansens, this chap, Junior, who I'm talking about in particular, were fairly pleased with themselves. And the cash allowed them to buy a small estate at Greyshot on the Hampshire-Surrey border, which Alyson's going to show you at the end, in proper countryside, unlike Clapham, because of course Clapham was getting built up like the centre was, but with proper good railway access to London, which of course they needed for their work. Well, so much to him, and now to the last of the trio. That's the grandson, Edward B. Jansen. The B stands for Blakeway, which is with his mother's name. And E.B. Jansen is almost entirely an architect. The grandfather is mostly a surveyor. The son is an architect, but a bit of surveying. But the grandson is nearly all architect, and that's quite a common pattern in the 19th century. That move towards the kind of higher, the more artistic and more prestigious end of this set of interrelated professions. He's dutiful, like his father, and he begins by joining him in the family practice as Junior had joined Senior. And it may be that some of the later buildings produced under Jansen Junior's name are really or mostly designed by the son. This is the one that interests me personally the most. Alas, gone in the Blitz like so much, and like so much in the city. This was the old Corn Exchange, and it's really a fascinating and rather original building. You can see at first sight it's one of these big Victorian market halls. But have a look, if you can see, at the stepped clerestories. I think they're very unusual. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's kind of granite and tough columns on the base. It's probably with iron inside them, and there's a great iron arches. But it's those clerestories that fascinate me. Must have been pretty chilly, I should think, inside that great roof like that. But no sign of it anymore. And I think one of the most important buildings of the dynasty. But from this is Junior and E.B. Jansen working together in the early 1880s. From about the time the Junior dies, you get a different kind of practice emerges, and this I find really interesting. Instead of offices and speculative buildings, you get E.B. things like cottage hospitals, convalescent homes, libraries, swimming pools, and the like, all in one version or another of the so-called Queen Anne style that was in vogue during the last decades of the 19th century. Here are a couple. On the left, there's the Newington Library, as was, which some of you may recognise from the Walworth Road. It's attached to the old Southwark Town Hall, because Newington was, in its day, an independent vestry. A part of the London Borough of Southwark got taken in 1900. On the right, the Newington Bars, which are not so far away. So these are all buildings built for the welfare of the people of that part of Southwark, Walworth we would now call it, but very much Newington its day. Now we could, I suppose, put these choices of buildings down to altruism on E.B.'s part. But I don't think that's really how it was. It's more likely these were the kinds of building that took priority in the 1880s and 90s, as London began to emerge from the long years of strenuous struggle to a rather calmer period when better public facilities came to the fore. As a kind of modesty, a kind of unthrusting feature to E.B.'s architecture, which I rather like. Here's another little one shown in one of those perspectives you get in the building press in the late 19th century. Some almshouses he built in Charlton down near Greenwich for the trustees of the Dutch church in the city. So the city connection goes on, but it's being shown in charitable work at this stage. So if you want to characterize E.B. Janssen's work, it's very confusing, all these three, I know, almost impossible to keep apart in your head. You can say that he adds a kind of grace note to the sterner achievements of his dad and his grandfather. So that's my lot, really. I would just sum it up by saying, here are three men whose careers span the 19th century. All of them are built outside central London, not least in Clapham, and Timothy is going to tell us about that in a moment. I like to see them as symbols of the struggles and genuine improvements which I think you can say London underwent during the century. The Janssens played a long and tenacious part in that process, and I suggest to you that that's how their careers are best understood and, I hope, also enjoyed. Thank you so much, and over to Timothy now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew and Alyson. I would very much like to echo Andrew's comments on Alyson as the not quite the only begetter of the book, but certainly the chief midwife. And I will now turn to the Janssens in Clapham and South London. This is, of course, what first attracted Peter's attention, because he kept finding houses and other buildings that they had been involved in, and they did all live in or around Clapham and left their mark in a wide variety of buildings. This map, which is in the book, just gives an idea. I don't expect you to be able to spot all the dots, but it just gives an idea of how widespread was their involvement. There were dots all over the place, all around Clapham High Street, Old Town, and so on, but there are also some more in Wandsworth, in Lavender Hill, and the Magdalen estate. Now, Clapham in the 1830s was no longer the paradise that it was when the Clapham sect lived on here, but it still attracted serious professional men and money. And Edwards Senior was one of these, and he built his cottage in the 1830s. Someone asked whether this was near a Burntwood Road, and that is, of course, true. It was. As it happened, then his daughter married a neighbour of his in Burntwood Grange and moved to one of the Queen Anne houses that are still standing in Old Town. His son then married the daughter of a resident of West Side. One has to realise that one of the advantages of Clapham was there were lots of appropriate young men and young women to be married off to each other, or to keep the money and the professional skills in the family. But when Edward had a father-in-law in West Side, Edward Senior also moved there in 1946 to a Georgian house that is still there at 83. Meanwhile, Edward Jr. lived in one of the Queen Anne houses on North Side. So you can see they were still enjoying what were then buildings 100 years old or so in Clapham. Now, Andrew has mentioned that Edward Jr. was in the forefront of developing speculative offices in the city. Andrew has mentioned the architectural innovation. They were the first ones that were built on spec without a client being identified in advance. And of course, that is the more common thing now. But despite this, he also found time to be active in Clapham, and he designed a number of local buildings. His first Clapham commission came in 1853 when he designed the rows of houses on North Side, Clapham Common, which I'm sure you are all already familiar with. What is interesting is that he has the end one. Actually, you can't see it from here. It is here. That is the end one. And what is interesting about that is that it is actually much larger than the other ones, because its front on Clapham Common, which is here, is smaller than the width of it on this road here. And so he took the advantage of being commissioned to build this to get a nice large house of his own. because although we view those houses in Northside were called church buildings as large, if you were a Victorian paterfamilias with wife, umpteen children, and lots of servants, you needed a lot of space, and this provided it. In 1959, he was commissioned to design a set of almshouses by two sisters who were nieces of George Hibbert, and these are the almshouses which are still there. It always strikes me as interesting that the chief parliamentary opponent of Wilberforce was a man called George Hibbert, who was the representative of Jamaica in London, as well as an MP, and he actually lived on Northside, not more than a quarter of a mile from Wilberforce. So the two main parliamentary contestants lived almost next door to each other. Other commissions that he made had clearly called for a greater degree of show than is appropriate in almshouses, and the first was shops, which are at 21, 22 the pavement, and you see the very nice rounded windows and decoration, and the ground floor, which was of course the shop, is there. Again, these were designed to attract people in. Well, the next one, which again you saw on the front page of the book, is the Alexandra Hotel. Again, hotels were supposed to look as though they were attractive and would attract people. The Alexandra Hotel was very important because it was at the time where it became acceptable for ladies that drink tea to drink tea in the Alexandra Hotel together, and that was socially acceptable. His last commission in Clapham was in 1881, and this involved smartening up a building to look more like a bank, which it was about to be. And here you see the original buildings were like this, and he tarted it up with lots of white stucco and decoration around the windows to make it look much more worthy of a place that people would entrust their money. But those of you who know Clapham will know the Carmen Tapas bar on the ground floor, which still has his other embellishments. Edward Jr. also played a full part in Clapham life, both professionally and socially. The socially was important because he met future clients and he got a lot of business, both in the city through his contacts in Clapham, but also with other members of the Clapham Society. Shortly after his arrival, he was asked to join the Clapham Athenaeum, a discussion group with several distinguished examples like Gideon Mantell, the geologist, J.P. Gassier, the photographer and scientist, the noted astronomer and actually headmaster of Clapham Grammar, Charles Pritchard. Edward Jr. gave a number of papers on a variety of architectural matters, often drawn from his travels. He also became a trustee of the almshouses he had helped to build and played a major part in the administration of the school. The girls' school was still in this 17th century building, and although he provided a sketch for its extension, it wasn't built. He also held the official role of district surveyor, which from time to time involved him in local controversy and the kind of arguments with builders and clients of the builders that still happens now. Now, as might be imagined, Edward Jr. also took part in a variety of speculative building, both on his own and as an estate manager. His first was putting together a package of land on west side of Clapham Common, which he then sold on to a builder. This land was actually next door to where his father had lived, and the result was 85 West Side, which is the Victorian house next to the two Georgian houses. You can just see one of them there. What's of interest about this house in particular is it is still a large villa, comparable to those originally built in Clapham, but in fact the market for these was already in decline. And that becomes a feature of much of the Edward Anson's speculation in Clapham. They always overestimated the capacity of the market to buy large houses. His next speculation demonstrates this. It involved land on the north side of Lambeth Hill. He started with the idea of 10-room villas, which still exist in Greyshot Road, actually named after the site he was about to move to. But the market for those had already gone, and in the end, much smaller terrace houses were built. Those are 120 to 128 Lavender Hill, and those are 150 to 152. In fact, he had great difficulty finding builders for these sites, and some of them he had to finish himself. Now, it was a bit before this, he made the change that so many people made who had moved out to Clapham from the city and moved out much further away. He moved to Greyshot on the Surrey-Hampshire border, where he built a house for himself and others for his children. This became possible as the train was built out there, and people could travel in easily by first class, of course, and in comfort, and still be home for tea in the evening. Unfortunately, Edward Jr. did not learn from his mistakes about building and continued to lay out estates in the Clapham area with villas that were far too large for the market. This included what we know now as the estate of Magdalen Road and the Toast Rack, which took a very long time to develop. Anson's original proposal to Magdalen College in 1865, but development took more than 20 years and longer for much of it. Anson and Son, the firm was now trading under that name, were eventually fired by Magdalen in 1894. Edward Anson and Son also developed other estates for clients. Clapham Manorial Estate was already so hemmed in by terrace housing that no alternative was possible. But there are developments of the Hankey Estate in North Clapham and the Telford Estate in Streatham both made the same error as before, laying it out for large villas rather than the terrace houses that were needed. I really don't understand why they went on making the mistake, whether it was a kind of wish fulfillment that Clapham was still full of large houses, semi-detached or detached, rather than rows of terrace housing, which has started to fill up all the spare land, I don't know. But that's what they did. Andrew's also already touched on some of Edward Blakeway Anson's work on estate development, and his major contribution, as Andrew said, was probably on public buildings. Many of these still survive in Clapham and nearby. The first, in 1885, was the Clapham School of Art. This has an interesting parapet decorated with griffin panels and vases in terracotta taken from Stiff's Lambeth Brewery, and there's a close-up for them. Next, in the same year, came the Clapham Library, although there were suspicions that the commission for this, which he won, was rigged in favour of Clapham locals, because it was owned by the people who owned the Clapham Manorial Estate, who were also on the organising committee, and Anson was also their architect. So there were public accusations of what we might call insider trading. This, of course, is now the Omnibus Theatre, where we would have had this talk in more normal and happier circumstances. Anson's next commission was also a library and was won in genuine competition. This is the Newington Library in the Walworth Road. It is much larger than that of Clapham, and indeed it cost over almost 4 times as much. Following that, he won the competition to build the Manor Place baths, which Andrew has already showed you the view of the women's bath. I assume the men's bath was much the same, but we don't have a photo of this. The baths closed when washhouses and slipper baths became redundant, and after a short spell as a Buddhist centre, it was converted to housing in 2019. I don't know what the Buddhists did to the swimming pool, but I'm sure it's not one now. The final building is St Anne's Hall and Mission House in Venn Street, Clapham. This was actually a clever design in that there were a number of entrances. One is there and one is there, and there's also a further one there, which meant that the different functions of the building could be accessed independently, thereby making it much easier. Edward Blakeway Jansen died in 1912 in his home in Kensington. His last works were outside Clapham, and he specialised in hospitals and nursing homes. His buildings are characterised by practicality and a good sense of space and proportion. He was not the last architect in the family, and his great nephew, Frank Jansen Broomfield, designed one of the best known memorial gardens and crematoria in Sydney, Australia. So that's the story of the buildings in Clapham, and I'll hand you back to Alyson.
Right. Thank you very much, Timothy, and thank you, and Andrew too, for your extremely kind comments. Over generous. I will just fill in a few gaps to bring it to a conclusion, show you a few pictures. You've seen these guys before, but these are of places that you can still see if you're very fortunate and look hard enough. This one is 88 Borough High Street in Southwark by Edward Jansen Jr., and it's an office as far as we know. It's a bit difficult to determine what it is exactly. Corn Exchange Chambers, which Andrew has already shown you, really in very good condition like that, and he said a lot about it. And I would say these new pictures were all taken by Dana Kubik with me when we were on a mission to find these places all over the place, from Newington down to Bermondsey to find the sluice keeper's cottage and so on. Very interesting adventures. But 65 Cornhill, I think, is one of the most iconic and the most beautiful surviving ones, with this very detailed and well-preserved exterior. But the thing I particularly like about it is its location, and this picture didn't get into the book, but it is right alongside all these skyscrapers in the city. And it's just rather a splendid combination, I think, of these conjunction of these buildings. So that's probably the best surviving building in the city you can see, because as Andrew said, the type of building went out so quickly. It was overcome once there was electricity and so on. This is St Bartholomew's Hospital Museum, which I understand, although I'm afraid I haven't yet seen it, looks pretty much like this today. And one very interesting thing about the St Bartholomew's Hospital is that the two successive Jansens were surveyors to the estate, to the hospital, and one of our members, Sinclair Johnson, is today's surveyor in a different way in those days, but a very nice connection with it. This, another one, a late one, which was built by E.B. Jansen and his then partner, I believe, which was then built as a hotel, and the facade survives, but it's now a hotel also, but somewhat different. And then I wanted to show this map, again, one similar to the one that Timothy showed you, of the city. It's fascinating in the book, and you want to spend ages pondering it, but just to show you that the area they concentrated on was around here. The pink dots, if you can see pink, are buildings they were associated with, and number one is Lawrence Pountney Lane, where they were based. But all these little the blues are churches, and they were associated with a lot of those. But the places they worked mostly were in this area. Here's Cornhill, the one surviving here, and then here's down here Seething Lane. But it's a very tight circle on the whole, apart from St Bartholomew's Hospital, which is up here, and the Charterhouse buildings, which are up here. Charterhouse now all completely different, but it's just a really interesting map, and in the book it's fascinating to study exactly where they were. And from there, we're going out to Greyshot, which you have heard from Andrew. Edward Jansen Jr. purchased the Greyshot estate in 1861. And at the time, Greyshot was a hamlet. It was tiny. It's not far from Hindhead. But the nearest bigger village is Headley. But at the time, this was very tiny, and his colleagues were scoffing at him and saying, "You'd never stay out there." But it was obviously chosen for healthy air and the countryside. And so Junior, as we're calling him, built quite a lot of stuff there. This referred to as President's Cottages. I'm sure it wasn't at that time, but no doubt so named when he became president of the Royal Academy, of the RIBA in 1887, very shortly before his death, actually. And then they were patrons of lots of things in there, including, that last one was built as originally for laundry cottages. This was built as the school, and there were other public buildings there. This is the church, which was built much later. When they originally went there, there was no church. And as we shall see later on, when Junior died, he couldn't be buried in this church because it wasn't there. But the person who was, I like this one, the builders of the church sitting up obviously on their lunch break or special photo call or something, but it's rather a fun photograph, I thought. And then the lady who became the sort of lady of the manor was one of Edward Jansen's daughters, who remained unmarried, but she took charge of everything. She was obviously in charge of the school, and she did a lot of good works for setting up laundries and a small library, I believe, all sorts of things that the Victorian lady occupied herself with probably quite a lot in a small village. And from there, we move on to another village, South Nutfield, which is the other side of Surrey, I suppose it's called. It's quite near Reigate. And the connection with this is slightly tenuous, but again, a lady who patronised the church, but she was the widow of one of E.B. Jansen's cousins. I've said before that it was a very extensive family, and a lot of their work came from within the family. Some of the commissions in Southwark were to do with the Woolerton family, which had a big sort of clan there. But so she was the lady of the manor, as it were, there. I also just wanted to show you rather briefly, because of the family connections and things, this portrait of Senior, which is by his great nephew, Frederick Lord Leighton, whom I'm sure you will all know. And the connection with that is that Edward Jansen's sister married a Leighton, Sir James Leighton. And so, again, there were connections that provided quite useful business, I think. Finally, the inscriptions from windows on their death. This is at Headley, and as I've said, at the time Junior died, there wasn't a Greyshot church. So these stained glass windows, which are tall and beautiful and in not very good condition, but there is this rather interesting inscription below in loving memory of Edward Jansen, who died, January 30, 1888, and is buried in the precincts of this church. And it's rather beautiful. I'm rather proud of this because Claire managed to clean it up to make it visible, which it wasn't particularly before. And finally, the brass to E.B. Jansen, the commemorating him, which is in St. Luke's Church, Greyshot, because he was responsible for building it. And by the time he died in 1912, he could be buried there. And that's actually the conclusion of the talk. I hope that has been of some value and interest to you, and that it will encourage you to at least go and have a look at the book, which is in stock at both at Clapham Books and at Herne Hill Books. It's also available to order at any bookshops online and even as an ebook. I do hope you will be encouraged to look at it and to find out more about the Jansons. Thank you very much indeed.